ChatGPT Skazal. The morning sunlight filtered through the tall windows of the Birmingham Public Library, painting golden rectangles on the scuffed linoleum floor as Malik Thompson pushed open the heavy oak door. At 11 years old, he felt a rush of quiet excitement every time he stepped into that hushed sanctuary. The scent of old paper and polished wood wrapped around him like a warm blanket, softening the harsh edges of the world outside, where his mother juggled two jobs just to keep their small apartment roof overhead. He padded along the narrow aisles, fingertips brushing spines whose titles promised adventures in distant galaxies and whispered secrets of lives he had never lived. He paused at a shelf labeled Fiction Y, pulled down a worn copy of the Chronicles of Amber, and settled at a low table beneath a mural of sprawling oak trees. As he turned the first page, the librarian's voice drifted over. "Mr. Thompson, you're here early again." He looked up to see Mrs. Caldwell, her white hair tied back in a tidy bun, carrying a stack of returned books. She offered him a kind smile that made him feel seen in a world that often overlooked boys like him. During story hour, Malik scribbled notes in his battered notebook, ideas for characters who wielded magic born of Southern folklore, heroes who outwitted cruel aristocrats in haunted mansions, worlds where justice was more than an ideal. Mrs. Caldwell leaned close and whispered, "You should enter the city's teen writing scholarship contest. They're looking for fresh voices this year." Malik's heart thudded. A scholarship could mean summer classes at the university writing camp, maybe even a chance to see the campus where real authors studied. He nodded, cheeks warm with possibility. But when the rejection letter arrived months later, it cut deeper than he expected. He reread the words until they blurred. "We regret to inform you." His hands shook as he unfolded the enclosed reviewer comments, and his chest tightened at phrases like, "Urban fantasy lacks universal appeal," and "protagonist's worldview feels too niche." He stared at the signature block, an all-white committee whose faces he did not know, but whose judgment felt like a slammed door. That evening, Malik climbed into his usual chair at home, head buzzing with hurt and anger. He opened his notebook and wrote until the page was thick with ink, an entire new world where the hero's identity was strength, not shame, where every lived experience was a treasure, not an obstacle. As the house settled under the low hum of the air conditioner, Malik Thompson vowed that he would tell his stories on his own terms, and that someday, everyone would listen. Malik stared at the glossy envelope in his hand long before he tore it open, his stomach fluttering with the hope that this might be his ticket out of endless doubt. When the letter finally slipped free, the words, "We regret to inform you," punched the air from his lungs. He sank onto the creaky wooden bench in his bedroom, the afternoon light slanting across his rejection notice and the reviewer comments left behind. Phrases like "lacks universal appeal" and "too niche for our readership." Each word felt like a verdict against everything he had poured into his writing, every late-night whisper of characters born from his imagination, dismissed as insignificant. The next day at the library, Malik's footsteps echoed louder than usual along the aisles. He balanced the rejection letter against the nearby spines of fairy tales and Gothic novels, wondering how the same room that once welcomed his dreams could now feel so cold. When Mrs. Caldwell approached with her usual warm greeting, he forced a smile and hid the paper deep in his satchel. But library assistants who once offered quiet encouragement now glanced at him with thinly veiled pity. In hushed tones, he overheard comments about a black kid from 35,203, lacking the background to craft stories that resonated beyond his own neighborhood. Their words cut deeper than any critique he had ever received in school. That evening, back in his cramped bedroom, Malik's anger flared into determination. He pulled out his battered notebook and recounted every hurtful phrase, burning them onto fresh pages of ink. Instead of shelving his dreams, he redirected them, writing a new manuscript that fused the haunting moors of Southern Gothic with the surreal magic of creeks that ran with liquid moonlight. His hero would not apologize for his roots. He would wield them like armor, turning prejudice into power. Malik labored over each paragraph, refusing to soften his language or conform to someone else's idea of universal. As midnight settled outside, Malik rose from his chair with ink-stained fingers and a racing heart. He read aloud the opening lines he had written. A boy walking the broken streets of an ancestral town, carrying secrets older than the iron rails behind him. In that hushed moment, he knew his story would not beg for acceptance. It would demand it. And he vowed that if the world refused to recognize his voice, he would make them shiver at its strength. Malik spent the first weekend after finishing his manuscript hunched over his laptop, teaching himself the ins and outs of self-publishing. He formatted his pages according to online templates, design-mocked a cover that married moonlit swamps with crumbling mansions, and ordered a modest print run through a local press. When the thick boxes of crisp paperback copies arrived at his front door, he felt a surge of triumph, unlike any he'd known in the quiet of his bedroom. He organized a small launch in the church basement down the street. Folded chairs beneath cracked fluorescent lights, a folding table stacked with books, and the smell of coffee and cinnamon rolls drifting in from the kitchen. Families from his neighborhood filed in, curious and supportive, and he read the first chapter aloud, his voice catching only once as he reached the words about a ghost whispering through Spanish moss. When he closed the book, someone clapped, then another, and by the end of the evening, every copy on the table was gone. Emboldened, Malik set up a dedicated author page on Goodreads and began inviting early readers to post honest reviews. He spent long evenings responding to comments, thanking strangers who marveled at his imagery, and promising them signed copies in the next shipment. Small literary blogs picked up on the buzz. One called his debut an unmissable collision of Southern Gothic and magic. Another tagged it the defining tale of our times. Each rave review fueled new orders from out-of-state readers, and soon he was balancing envelopes of cash against stacks of shipping labels. His phone buzzed nonstop with order notifications, and his email flooded with enthusiastic requests for interviews and guest posts. Despite his growing fan base, Malik's heart sank when he visited the very library that had dismissed him. He approached the circulation desk holding a pristine copy of his bestseller and asked if they would consider adding it to the shelves. The head librarian flipped through her policy binder and shook her head gently. "I'm sorry, Malik. We can't accept self-published titles unless they're reviewed by one of the approved journals." Their cataloging system had no slot for grassroots sensation or local phenomenon, and his success counted for nothing without institutional validation. He left with the book pressed against his chest like a shield, but instead of defeat, he felt a sharper resolve. If the libraries wouldn't come to him, he would show them what they'd missed. He vowed to keep writing, keep proving that stories born in overlooked corners could light up the world, even if the shelves remained empty for a little while longer. Malik woke to the sound of notification pings bouncing across his phone like excited applause. Bleary-eyed, he unlocked the screen and scanned a wave of messages from friends, readers, and total strangers, all pointing to the same headline. A nationally recognized book influencer, with millions of followers, had just sworn by his novel, calling it the hidden jewel of modern fiction. Within minutes, clips of the influencer's enthusiastic review circulated through Twitter and TikTok, framing Malik's story as the underdog triumph no one saw coming. By midday, his inbox overflowed with emails from independent bookstores asking for bulk orders, literary podcasts begging for interviews, and university creative writing programs offering scholarship sponsorships if he'd speak at their next symposium. Bookstores that had ordered only 10 copies now scrambled to restock 50, 60, 100 more, while online retailers bumped his title into their most popular carousels. Malik watched the sales charts spike in real time, digits climbing so fast it made his head spin. His debut manuscript, once a lonely stack of paper in a church basement, was now breathing on bestseller lists across the country. In the midst of celebration, he reached out to his hometown library, hoping they might finally welcome him home. He imagined delivering a reading to a crowd of familiar faces, sharing that first magic he'd discovered among their dusty shelves. Instead, his request was met with polite but firm resistance. The head librarian explained that their acquisitions budget had already been allocated for the year, and that their cataloging policy prioritized titles vetted by professional review journals. Self-published works simply didn't qualify. He offered to revisit in the next cycle, but the disappointment in her tone was unmistakable. Malik closed his laptop and stared at the ceiling, tasting the bitterness that comes when triumph collides with institutional inertia. Determined not to let the silence persist, he organized a small signing at a local cafe one Saturday afternoon. Word had reached the community. Lines formed around the block, neighbors clutching their newly purchased copies, eager to meet the author who had captured hearts far beyond Birmingham. Children wore T-shirts emblazoned with quotes from his book, and local reporters covered the scene with wide-angle lenses. Yet the stark contrast between that warm gathering and the empty reading table at the library stung him all the same. That evening, Malik drafted an open letter addressed to public libraries nationwide. He poured out his gratitude for the institutions that had once nurtured his love of reading, then laid bare the frustration of exclusion he still felt despite his newfound acclaim. He cited statistics showing skyrocketing demand for diverse voices and argued that self-published success deserved a spot on every shelf. When he posted the letter on his author website and shared it across social media, it ignited another wave of conversation. Hashtags like Libraries for All and Bring Malik Home trended locally and beyond, spurring calls for dialogue between community advocates and library boards. As midnight approached, Malik closed his laptop with a sudden sense of resolve. The arrow of his own success had pierced industry gatekeepers, and now it pointed straight at the quiet bunkers of library administration. His bestseller had rewritten the rules of publishing, but now he was intent on rewriting the rules of who gets heard, whose stories get told, and who holds the keys to the shelves. The next chapter of his fight was just beginning. Malik pushed open the library's heavy oak doors one quiet morning, clutching a stack of fresh paperback copies of his novel. He had arranged to donate them and to read excerpts for the children's summer program, something he'd dreamed of since he first discovered his love of stories here. Instead, the head librarian led him to a cramped back office, where she apologized for the library's policy. Self-published authors, she explained, could not be featured in events or have their books added to the collection unless they had recommendations from accredited journals, and her staff held master's degrees in library science. Malik leaned forward, stunned by the words, and asked why a bestseller with thousands of readers and glowing reviews should still be judged unworthy. The librarian's eyes flicked to the door as if seeking escape, but her voice remained firm. Rules are rules. A hush fell over the small group, clustered near the entrance, until a retired teacher raised her phone and began recording. The conversation, his respectful but insistent questions, and the librarian's polite but unyielding responses unfolded in real time on screen. Within an hour, the video racked up thousands of views, shared on Twitter and Instagram under bold captions. Local library snubs best-selling author, and When Credentials Trump Community. Whereas Malik Thompson and Libraries for All shot to the top of regional trending lists as readers, writers, and activists flooded their feeds with outrage. Comments poured in. This is exactly why we need more diverse voices on the shelves. Libraries should serve their communities, not gatekeep them. And policies aren't more important than people. By afternoon, local news crews had set up tripods on the library steps. Malik stepped outside, the midday sun casting long shadows across the stone pillars as reporters raised microphones. He spoke calmly, his voice carrying across the plaza. This building welcomed me as a boy and inspired my life's work. Now it refuses to acknowledge that very success. If libraries are meant to be bastions of knowledge and inclusion, their doors should open to every story, not lock out the ones that need telling most. His words echoed off the silent arches, and passers-by paused, some nodding, others staring with newly awakened curiosity. As evening fell, community members gathered on the lawn with protest signs and impromptu book readings, each person taking turns to read passages from Malik's novel. Teachers brought students, librarians from neighboring districts showed their support, and even the retired mail carrier who first tutored Malik in reading helped lead chants of Our Voices Matter. Somewhere in the crowd, a local council member slipped Malik a note, promising to introduce a motion at the next meeting. Watching the sea of faces, young and old, every shade of the human spectrum, Malik felt the swell of collective power. The roar of the crowd was more than a demand. It was a declaration that the rules would have to change. The boardroom was suffused with the late afternoon glow filtering through tall, mullioned windows, yet inside it felt stifling. Rows of stiff-backed chairs, polished oak table, and a gathering tension that made every breath feel deliberate. Members of the Birmingham Public Library Board took their seats under the watchful portrait of the library's founding director, a woman whose stern gaze seemed surprised by the commotion unfolding in her institution. At the head of the table sat the board chair, adjusting her glasses as she cleared her throat to call the emergency session to order. Around her, trustees in conservative suits exchanged uneasy glances, aware that cameras from the local news station lined the back wall, recording every moment. Minutes earlier, a leaked memo had circulated describing how, year after year, the library's hiring panels had favored graduates of the same handful of university library science programs whose student bodies had historically lacked racial diversity. One board member, a retired attorney, produced a stack of resumes to illustrate the point. Identical credentials, identical backgrounds, and not a single candidate of color among the recent hires. It wasn't deliberate discrimination, he said quietly, lifting his eyes to meet those of his colleagues. But our process has cultivated a monoculture by default. The word hung uncomfortably in the air, and a younger trustee cleared her throat, fidgeting with her pen. Our policies are centuries old, she said. They were meant to guarantee professional standards. If we change them now, what guarantee remains of the librarian's competence? At that moment, a door at the far end of the room opened, and Malik Thompson stepped in, escorted by a city council liaison. Conversation faltered as all eyes turned to the best-selling author who had ignited the crisis. His calm presence belied the fire that had carried him from those dusty stacks as a boy to speaking truth to power in front of millions of readers. He carried a slim binder of testimony, emails from readers, screenshots of trending hashtags, and excerpts from the viral video at the library desk. When he spoke, his voice was steady but edged with urgency. I'm here not to vilify anyone, but to remind us all why libraries exist in the first place, to serve every member of their community, not just those who fit a narrow mold. He laid out concrete proposals, broadened hiring criteria to include community engagement experience, language skills reflecting Birmingham's demographics, and proven advocacy for underserved neighborhoods. He urged the board to create an apprenticeship pathway that would train local residents, library pages, volunteers, customer service staff, to become catalogers and program coordinators, even if they lacked traditional degrees. The kids reading my book, he said, looking around the room, deserve to see themselves in these walls, from the children's librarian to the head of circulation. They need role models who look like them, who share their stories. A hush followed his remarks, broken only by the ticking of the ornate clock on the wall. Then the board chair thanked him and opened the floor for discussion. A senior trustee, known for her insistence on long-standing academic criteria, hesitated before admitting, I've been skeptical, but I can't ignore the evidence. Our community has spoken eloquently through Malik's voice and through their actions. Perhaps it's time our rules spoke their language. Murmurs of agreement rippled around the table, and several members nodded as they scribbled notes. By the time the meeting adjourned, the board had drafted preliminary language for sweeping reforms, abolishing exclusive degree requirements, mandating community service hours for all applicants, and partnering with local colleges to create certification programs accessible to non-traditional students. They agreed to reconvene with public comment invited at the next hearing. As the board members filtered out into the hallway, some smiling, some deep in thought, Malik lingered a moment to speak privately with the chair. Their conversation was soft but sincere, filled with mutual respect and a shared sense of purpose. Walking out into the cooling evening air, Malik felt the weight of expectation lighten just enough to let hope slip in. He knew the fight wasn't over until ink met paper on the final policy, but he also knew that by stepping behind the closed doors of power, he had transformed whispered grievances into a mandate for change. The portrait of the library's founder faced him as he left, and for the first time, he dared to imagine that her stern gaze might be witnessing a new chapter, one where every voice, no matter how young or overlooked, could claim its rightful place in the stacks. Sunlight filtered through the newly installed skylight of the East Side branch as community curator Jasmine Rodriguez unlocked the heavy oak doors for the first time in her new role. She stepped inside alongside Malik, who watched with a gentle pride as Jasmine's beaming smile greeted a group of children gathered for morning story time. Their faces, a tapestry of every shade and culture in Birmingham, lit up when Jasmine reached for Malik's novel from the shelf, its bright spine nestled between classics and contemporary works. No longer would his book live in exile. Here it belonged, as a testament to perseverance and change. Across town, at the West End branch, Malik assisted in inaugurating the apprenticeship program he had helped design. He guided a small cohort, an aspiring playwright, a high school senior fluent in Spanish, and a retiree who spoke both Swahili and English, through their first lesson in cataloging and community outreach. They laughed as they learned to scan ISBNs and match call numbers. But Malik reminded them that their true task was to listen first, to the hopes of neighborhood teens, to requests from seniors who remembered segregated libraries, and to new immigrants seeking books in their native tongues. With each handshake and shared story, the walls of the library grew warmer, more reflective of the city's rich tapestry. That afternoon, the main branch hosted its first Voices of Birmingham panel, featuring local authors of every background. Malik introduced each speaker, an LGBTQ+ poet, a Cherokee playwright, a Vietnamese American historian, underscoring how far the institution had come from its old, narrow hiring practices. Audience members cheered when the newly appointed head librarian, herself a graduate of the apprenticeship program, announced an endowment fund to sponsor future curators and writers from underrepresented communities. As Malik listened, he felt the pulse of possibility echo in every clap. By evening, boxes of his novel had arrived at every branch. Custodians unpacked them alongside graphic novels by kids from the apprenticeship program, and librarians from neighboring counties celebrated by live streaming a joint reading event. When Malik finally closed his eyes that night, he saw not empty shelves but full ones. Stories that once struggled to find a home now stood shoulder to shoulder, ready to invite any reader inside. And in the hush that followed closing time, he whispered a quiet vow to keep turning library doors into gateways for every voice brave enough to tell a story.